Good morning. I'm Eric Schur, the U.S. Technical Lead with Corteva Agriscience on the Crop Protection Marketing Department. It's my pleasure here to be today hosting and serving as the moderator for our Staying Ahead of the Threat webinar. Today we've got two excellent resources. I think you're going to learn a lot today from Ron Geis, Jason Gibson, as we really talk about pests and disease alerts. Our main focus here today is really going to be around fungicides and insecticides and insects and plant pathogens, diseases, and how to monitor that. We know you've already been fighting some weeds here for the past probably 30, 60 days already. Hopefully you've kind of got that under control. But before we start, Ron, why don't you give us a little bit of introduction about yourself and kind of where you're at?
So I'm the market development specialist for the northern part of Iowa. And actually, yesterday was my 41st anniversary with the company, and been in either sales or some field development and this market development specialist role here. The last 25 years have been in Iowa, the Northwest Iowa, and then say the last since merger DuPont and Dow merged together, the formation of Corteva. Then that's about the time I've covered the northern part of the state of Iowa.
And Jason, could you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us where you're located?
Yeah, good morning, Eric. Jason Gibson. I'm a market development specialist like Ron. I cover the state of Nebraska. I live in the eastern part of state of Nebraska at Elkhorn. Been with Corteva Agriscience now approaching 26 years.
Great, great. Folks, for those of you on our webinar here today, if you have questions, please use that Q&A feature. It might be at the very bottom of your screen or the top of the screen, depending on how your Zoom is set up. We'll try to take those questions as we go throughout the time so that they're top of mind and we'll try to address them. You know, as we start thinking about pests and diseases, Ron, one of the first questions I think a lot of growers are always asking is, what am I looking for? How do I look for it? Because we want to make a good decision. They want to make sure they're knowing what they're looking at is the right disease or insect, and they want to make sure is it really needed to go spray. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Well, we all are going to talk about the importance of scouting fields and putting boots on the ground. And I know as we're coming through the herbicide season or the weed control season, it gets somewhat routine and a little bit tempting to drive past the field at 50 miles an hour and look out the window and do I see weeds or do I not see weeds? And I'm not saying that's the best way to scout for weeds, but it's sometimes adequate. Not so when it comes to diseases, and certainly not so when it comes to insects, because they're smaller and you can't really see them from the seat of a pickup. Can't even begin to think you can see them. Or let's put it a different way. If it's at a point where you can see them from the seat of the pickup, it's probably past the point of return as to taking good action. So it is important to scout and use the tools that we have available. When I say the tools available, so let's think of what we now have at our disposal. We have drones, so we can fly a drone over the field that can identify problem areas within a field. Well, that makes it a lot more efficient to know, well, there's something going on there where you have different colors. Let's go see what's going on there. Or we have satellite images that do the same. So we can help direct our scouting through using some of those tools. Another thing that's at our disposal at this point are disease and insect alerts. So let's say take a pest like southern rust, which by definition, or even its name, it comes from the south and moves its way north. If we start to see that progressing further north and it's starting to get closer to your county, well, then it's probably getting time to be on the lookout for that. Or things like soybean aphids. They have a history of starting along cricks or typically areas to the north. So those of us in northern Iowa, we subscribe to the Minnesota newsletters and watch the progression of aphids. Seems like they'll tend to, if on some of the heavier infestation years, they'll tend to come down from Minnesota. So as we watch them getting closer, then that alerts us to get our boots on the ground and start looking. So a number of tools that are out there, between the internet and just good old-fashioned walking. is just knowing what to look for, what you're looking for when you do go through and scout fields. And just as important as looking for the right problem is how you go about looking for a problem. Several different scouting patterns are suggested here. I tend to favor the two more so on the bottom as opposed to certainly the one in the top right. Now let's just kind of dissect that a little bit. Take the one in the top right. If I've got a problem population distributed like it is in the photo, well, that's great. Eventually, I'm going to run into that problem, be it a disease problem or an insect problem. But what if that same, if the population in the left, the clumped um, photo, if that was my problem area, but I did a field border scouting, you notice where my blue line is. I totally miss that. So getting areas within the field, thorough representation of the area, so you get a good overall look at what the problem is, and then you're able to make your management decision based on what you're seeing. And then finally, we'll get more specific into disease scouting. Understand what it takes to actually have disease problems. We talk often about the disease triangle, and that's a culmination of three things coming together all at once. Thing number one is your pathogens. You need to have the pathogen in the field. Let's turn the clock back 10 years ago. Tar spot was not a pathogen that was in our fields, so we didn't look for, worry about, scout for tar spot. Now we move ahead today. Tar spot is pretty well swept across the whole northern corn belt, and it's the pathogens. If they're not in your field, they're in a field very nearby. And when you look at pathogen movement, something like tar spot was on the Mississippi River, and 2 years later, it was on the Missouri River, a full state away. So those pathogens can move and move rather quickly if they're windborne. The host is, obviously another important thing. Tar spot doesn't affect soybeans, so when I'm planting soybeans, I don't worry about tar spot. But if I'm in a soybean and corn rotation, the disease, the pathogen will stay there for several years, and when I'm planting that host crop, that's when I have to be worried about that. Finally, intersecting all three of those with the environment. So if I've got the right weather conditions for a disease, which is typically a moist environment, that's when disease problems tend to rear their ugly head. Now, if we're in the throes of a drought, it doesn't mean that we won't have diseases because we can get those right environments, even if it's for a short period of time. If it's a critical time or at the right time for a disease to propagate, 3 or 4 days of leaf wetness, we can all of a sudden have a disease problem spring up, and then we've got to be on the lookout for that. Now, on the same token, if we're in the throes of a drought and not getting an environment for a disease, I'm going to contrast that with insects. Insects don't necessarily thrive per se based on moisture, but the damage from insects, particularly piercing and sucking insects, during the midst of a drought, the damage can be much, much worse because you're in an already moisture limited situation. And now I've got an insect in there that's taking that precious limited amount of moisture out of the plants, and that's causing extra problems and extra stress in that field situation.
Ron, you brought up a lot of good points, and we're not quite there yet for a lot of our diseases in soybean and corn fields. Insects could be a problem, but knowing what to look for and kind of where to look for is really important to make a good, accurate decision. Jason, do you want to kind of start walking us through the soybean diseases and insects? And I know, Ron, you've got some comments there, and let our customers really know what they're looking for and when to look for it and how to protect those plants.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Key thing that I would suggest is for a lot of land grant universities, the university extension offices put out scouting calendars for your state by crop, by month. And in the lower part of the screen here, you see some key diseases listed by month when you expect to see those. Just having a general understanding of what to look for before you start approaching the field can be extremely helpful. Many of these diseases, in particular listed here, are supported through good genetics. Finding genetics that have good tolerance to things like brown stem rot, for example, or sudden death syndrome. We're going to spend a little bit more time on those foliar diseases, in particular those that we might consider a fungicide application for. But nonetheless, reach out to your seed companies, your extension offices, and Corteva Agriscience for some of those scouting calendars that do exist, help prepare you for the upcoming season. So when I think about foliar diseases, I really think about a lot of our potential foliar applications occurring somewhere in that R1 to R4 growth stage, which a bulk of our applications will go out at R3, cover a lot of our major diseases, and one in particular that is a common treatment we make for that across the wide area is frog eye leaf spot. But one of the things that with a lot of diseases, we see them and then we look at the amount of area impacted by the disease, and we look at the cost of the fungicide, the cost of the application, and then we figure out if the economics justify making that application. One of those diseases, though, that we don't want to see, we actually want to start treating ahead of seeing the disease for it to be effective, is white mold. So I want to go into a little bit more discussion specifically this morning on white mold. Viatude is an excellent two mode of action fungicides that's very effective on white mold. But a couple of things that are really important to identify with white mold is to be successful and to suppress the disease, you have to be preventative. So if you have a field history of white mold, you're probably in a situation where you really need to spray twice, making that first application somewhere between beginning flower and full flower, kind of between R1 and R2, and then 14 days later, follow up with the second application, more in that R2 to R3 window. So R3 would be beginning pod, R2 would be full bloom. So it's really important that we cover that flowering period. Anymore with earlier planting windows, that window of flowering is a lot longer. So we may have a 5 to 6 week period of flowering. I generally suggest we kind of ignore that first week of flowering and that last week of flowering and focus really on those center 4 weeks of flowering. This particular disease, you're going to really try to get your fungicide to cover the blooms, the dying blooms. That's where white mold will do the infection into the plant, is through those dying blooms. So we're really protecting the bloom more than we're protecting the leaf area when it comes to white mold. The other thing for some that are on the or webinar here today is for those that do irrigate. It's important during that flowering period to reduce the frequency as well as the quantity that you're applying per application. Again, the wetter that environment is, back to Ron's comment on soil moisture, humidity, generally tend to favor diseases, including white mold. We want to kind of have some dry periods through that flowering period, not just consistently wet. Viatude is new to the market. One of the unique things about Viatude is its group 11 active ingredient picoxystrobin is a very good product when it comes to producing a healthier plant, helping produce more chlorophyll, which is important for photosynthesis, also helping that plant mitigate heat and drought stress, along with the prothioconazole we've added to the picoxystrobin in Viatude. Both active ingredients are very effective at suppressing white mold. So here's a little bit on the performance. On the left, a one-pass program. One of the things that some are fearful of making a fungicide application, what happens if I'm thinking I'm going to have white mold, but it doesn't materialize? That would be a little bit evident in that one pass program where we still see a yield benefit. Again, even in the absence of disease development, we oftentimes see a yield increase in soybeans with the application of Viatude. Primarily, the primary driver behind that is that picoxystrobin active group 11 fungicide in Viatude. When we look off to the right and get more into a true situation where we have white mold, then we want to do a two-pass application. And again, the timing of that application is very critical. Also, really important, while there are a lot of products listed for white mold or sclerotinia, stem rot on various fungicide labels, they don't all perform equal. There's about 5 to 6 fungicides that are very effective on white mold. Please reach out to your universities for that data. Approach and Viatude both are very well respected and very highly rated when it comes to suppressing white mold. Other key diseases, a little bit broader range of things. When I think of things of Septoria brown spot, frog eye leaf spot, pod and stem blight, and Cercospora blight, my mind takes me to a product like Approach Prima, where it's covering more of our more common diseases that we'll have year to year. Frog eye leaf spot being the number one disease probably across the U.S. The things that's unique about Approach Prima is we have two active ingredients, a group 11 and a group 3, that can provide both preventative and curative activity. Approach is unique in several aspects. One of those is its rainfast period of 1 hour. Very few fungicides have that short of a rainfast period. A crop consultant approached me last fall showing me data of other fungicides where the farmer was irrigating right behind the fungicide application. And for the first 8 to 10 hours where that water was traveling, they saw a 20 to 30 bushel yield hit to southern rust because essentially that overhead irrigation was washing off that fungicide. So no Approach Prima has a 1 hour rainfast period can really reduce the loss of productivity due to an unexpected rain or if you're an irrigator. The other thing that I want to mention too is its movement properties. It's very systemic. It will have a vapor phase to it, helping it move within the canopy itself. Also, is translaminar, so that droplet as it reaches the top of the surface will travel to the underneath side of the leaf, providing full protection. Here's a little bit of data on Approach Prima. It's been a very consistent performer in the marketplace, as well on frog eye leaf spot. I think the thing that draws people to Approach Prima is the performance as well as the cost per acre. It's a very attractive fungicide from that perspective. Ron?
Yeah, and over in Iowa, I'm just going to add we've done a combination of Approach Prima spiked up with Approach to get the picoxystrobin rate up there higher to give better white mold management, even in a two-pass system. Now, of course, with Viatude, it's preloaded with that high rate of picoxystrobin, so we can kind of keep it to a single chemical in our white mold management. While we're managing diseases, we also want to keep our eyes open for what insect problems that we have in soybeans as well. Of course, you recognize this chart from earlier. We've just highlighted the insect portion. And as you look at the insect portion, it looks like it's not too bad, just a small handful of insects. That doesn't mean that they're not very damaging, though. We spent a little time earlier talking about bean leaf beetle and the 3 different stages of bean leaf beetles. Early on, like I say, right now, it is a time to be scouting heavily for those. We'll want to scout heavily for bean leaf beetles again in late July, early August, and that tends to correspond real well with a typical R3 fungicide timing. And then finally, bean leaf beetles, we need to be on the lookout a little closer to Labor Day. as that next generation will emerge at about that time, and they're not very forgiving. What their favorite food is at that time seems to be the petiole. Um, I think that's what that's called. That holds the pod onto the stem, and they clip that little area, dropping pods off. And there's probably nothing more disheartening as you get this close to soybean harvest. You're around Labor Day, and then you find a whole bunch of pods sitting on the ground. So keeping our eyes open for bean leaf beetle. I'll say this: back before seed treatments became a normal thing, bean leaf beetle was a major pest in soybeans. Once we've adopted the seed treatments, um, that has drastically reduced the population of the bean leaf beetles, and so that late season pod clipping has been a lot less of an issue. That also being said, the seed treatments that we're using are primarily neonicotinoid based. Now, why is that significant? As we're starting to get some of these other pest problems, and I'll talk about soybean aphids here real soon, but the standard treatment we've used on foliar soybean pest management has been pyrethroid chemistry, and we're now starting to find a lot of tolerance to soybean aphids have gotten a lot of tolerance to the pyrethroids. Well, when that happens, we naturally want to find another mode of action to control that pest. And one of those modes would be the neonicotinoids that we're already using as our seed treatments. All right, let me give you a big caution here. If we run the neonicotinoids, the group 4As, as our foliar application, as well as our seed treatment application, all right, we've all been through this cycle in the weeds where we keep that same active or same modes of action multiple times, and that just leads to a shorter lifespan for that particular class of chemistry. I love the neonicotinoids as a seed treatment. They have been a huge benefit to us. I don't want to shorten their life cycle and their useful cycle by reliance on them as foliar applications as well. So that brings me to soybean aphids. Um, Sort of the life history of soybean aphids across the Midwest, certainly through the state of Iowa. They started to show up in the early 2000s. In 2003, I'm going to say they made their first big appearance in the state of Iowa. Numbers grew, and in 2008, we had the Armageddon of soybean aphids. They were early and thick, and some fields required two, if not three applications to get control, not because of resistance, but just the sheer numbers of aphids that were upon us. Soybean aphids are born pregnant, and the daughters in the womb are pregnant too. So when an aphid's born, there's two generations within that same aphid. So under the right conditions, I can simply say when it's nice outside for you and I, it's nice outside for soybean aphid reproduction, and those numbers can just literally explode in a short amount of time. So that gets back to good and proper scouting and using other tools, such as, hey, they're having the aphid outbreak, 2 counties away. You better be paying attention to your own fields because they can grow wings and move, pretty far, pretty fast. The one that's sandwiched in between on this chart, the spider mites, they kind of present a particular problem. Spider mites are known to flare up if you don't include an insecticide that has activity on spider mites. And most of the pyrethroids, and I'm going to say most of the insecticides that we do use, um, are not active on spider mites. So if we knock out spider mites competition, then the spider mites are able to flourish in that environment. So you want to kind of keep an eye out for the spider mite potential. Spider mites are particularly bad when it's a drought conditions. And that's one that'll kind of clean your clock in a drought. Those are the kind of conditions that they really thrive. When it's wet out, there is a fungus that helps to keep those populations in check. Japanese beetles have shown up on the scene in about the last 10 to 12 years. One of the interesting quirks with Japanese beetles are they are highly attracted to exterior light. So if you've got yard lights, for instance, that's where we'll tend to find higher numbers of Japanese beetles. And as such, the closer to town a field is, the more apt we are to find the Japanese beetles. Now, once they get in an area, they can move quickly and spread to other fields, but that will tend to be the first places to look. And then stink bugs, these last few years have also become a bigger problem. A lot of your insecticides, standard rates of those insecticides, will take care of the pest problems that you see a little higher up on the page, might require elevated rates when we start looking at stink bugs. There are established thresholds of the amount of damage that we can experience with insects, and uh, and kind of the trigger levels for those. I'm going to encourage you here, if you've got your phone, your camera, take a snapshot of this. We're not going to like discuss every single one of these, but right now we're focused on soybeans, and you see the different pests that we talked about. Aphid trigger point being 250 aphids per plant. Bean leaf beetles, that's more of a defoliation, like a 20% defoliation level that triggers taking care of it. I'm going to a little bit tongue in cheek that one. That last generation that we talked about, those that clip the pods, more so there, I'm looking at pods on the ground. If I'm finding pods on the ground and existing populations of bean leaf beetles, I'm going to be very quick to pull the trigger because the damage they can do that close to harvest is it's a lot of damage and it comes in real quick. Stink bugs, here we're looking more at populations. And when we get down to Japanese beetles, we're back to like a 30% defoliation level as a trigger point for taking care of them. So we've talked about that defoliation level. Here's just a pictorial of what 20% or 30% defoliation looks like. And I know a lot of you on this call are going to look at that photo and you might agree with that 5% or 10%. But as that defoliation gets more, I think as we look at these crops and we start to see defoliation at the level of 15 or 20%, I think mentally we're thinking that's more like 50 or 80% defoliation. It's really not. Through all the laser technology or mass spectrometer or whatever we use to count this up, this is what those defoliations look like. So I think really what we're saying is the plants can tolerate a little bit more than maybe what our emotions can tolerate. But if you don't have a pictorial start of what that defoliation looks like, it's pretty easy to gravitate towards thinking that the problem is bigger than what it actually is.
Yeah, Ron,
About
they
three.
say the human eye does overestimate whether you're looking at defoliation due to insects or even the presence of disease on leaf area. Your eye
Mhm.
commonly overestimates, I believe, by 30%. So take that into consideration as you're out evaluating leaf loss. due to insects or diseases that you're likely probably overestimating a little bit what you think is the percentage is probably a little bit less than what you think.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks a lot there, Jason. That's a very good add. A few years back, 3 or 4 years ago, we introduced the product Ridgeback insecticide. Ridgeback is a combination of isoclass active, I'm going to say a fairly new active ingredient, which is extremely focused on piercing, sucking insects. The isoclass highly effective on soybean aphids, and then as we elevate the use rates, it also brings in some suppression of stink bugs. But when we look at the disease or the insect complex, and we went through all of them, well, that's also missing a few key insects like the Japanese beetles, like spider mites, like bean leaf beetles. So we combined in Ridgeback the isoclass with a pyrethroid bifenthrin, which is still highly active on the rest of these insect problems that we talked about. So when we think about triggering an application of Ridgeback, what drives Ridgeback application, say, as opposed to just a regular pyrethroid application? It really kind of comes into how effective those pyrethroids are at controlling soybean aphids and how long they're going to be effective. As we look in Minnesota, and it's certainly working its way into northern Iowa, kind of going back to our calendar, 2008 was real bad for aphids. And then from 2008 until about 2018, we had what I'm going to call normal, steady aphid problems, aphid pressures. And we mostly attacked that with pyrethroid insecticides. Some cases, chlorpyrifos or lorsban, but that's how we sort of stayed on top of that. And then from about 2018 until last year, 2024, I'm going to say aphids tended to be a bit in a suppression, or we just didn't see a whole lot of them, and consequently didn't treat because we didn't have aphids to treat. Other insects were not that big of a problem. Occasionally, those drought years, spider mites reared up, and so you'd treat certain fields for spider mites. But with the absence of insecticide use on aphids, I think we kind of got lulled into thinking that once aphids showed back up, which they did in 2024, we'd just go back to what we had been doing. Unfortunately, when we sprayed pyrethroids, straight pyrethroids this past summer, the pyrethroids were not giving us the kind of control that we had seen previous on soybean aphids. It's still working pretty good on the rest of the pests, but not on soybean aphids. So that's what it's going to drive a second active ingredient, and that's where the isoclass active comes in. So what the isoclass is bringing to the Ridgeback application is a high level of aphid knockdown, and then also a substantial amount of aphid residual control. We're very comfortable to tell you at standard use rates that you can expect aphid residual for 2 weeks. And if the weather conditions are favorable, we've seen up to 3 weeks of residual control from a Ridgeback application. So this all circles back to know what you're looking for and scout, do a good thorough job of scouting. And that also includes using other resources that are available to you so you know as insects are coming, what to be watching for and when to be watching for them.
Ron, Jason, think that's a really nice overview of talking about insects, diseases here for soybeans. Before we switch to corn, folks, I do want to remind you, if you have questions, use that Q&A feature. We'll obviously take questions at the end of the webinar here today. If you've got them while we're going through, we'll try to address them on the go. Jason, kind of walk us now through the corn diseases and some of the things that growers should be thinking about there.
Yeah, Eric, let's discuss a little bit on corn diseases. Again, going back to the corn scouting calendar, much like what we did with the soybeans, gives you a good picture of some of the key diseases by stage of growth that we can see. As I think about corn across the Midwest and as well outside the Midwest, some of the more common diseases we'll run into are things like your common rust, your gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight. And we'll talk a little bit more about a new disease that's been more recent, tar spot, here in just a moment. But those are some common diseases. I think Ron mentioned earlier from the south with some tropical storms, we can see from every so often southern rusts get blown up and can be problematic. It was a little bit more of an issue last year for farmers in Nebraska than maybe what we typically see. But again, that's based a little bit more off of tropical storms versus the disease that originates from the residue remaining in the field. So as we think about fungicides and diseases and kind of where do they overlap, while there are fungicide applications made earlier in the season, let's say V4, V6, those oftentimes are things maybe for anthracnose or for plant health effects to get that plant up and going, maybe mitigating some early stressful conditions. But as we think about fungicide applications later, kind of that key application window for many of our diseases is going to be in that VT to R2 stage, is where we're going to make the bulk of the fungicide applications. When we think about new diseases, tar spot being one of those, just a few interesting things and nuggets on tar spot. Learning a lot more about the disease. Some recent work done by University of Minnesota is indicating that from infection to actually seeing the stomata show up on the leaf surface, that period of time might be closer to 21-day period, 19 to 21-day period. So and then reinfection or secondary infection. So once that initial spores get up on the plant, infect the plant, you get the stomata or the leaf symptomology to then populate and see another flush, if you will, of tar spot might take up to another 19 to 21 days. So what that's maybe starting to indicate is we can be a little bit more proactive on this disease in terms of our application timing, where maybe when we first were working with it back in 2015, 2016, maybe got a little bit more reactionary with our application instead of
Mhm.
being as proactive as I think we can be going forward. So some of the worst cases of tar spot have been in years where it maybe in June got some early infections when it was a little bit cooler, wetter, a little more humid, and then only to have July be hot and dry and then in August to return to kind of cooler, more humid conditions, and then that disease really take off. So this disease can kind of go through a lull in temperatures, ideal temperatures, and still be pretty impactful. So it's definitely one that in August, September, you don't want to fall asleep on. One of the fungicides that works particularly effective on tar spot that has a very good rating on it is Approach Prima. We talked earlier about its quick rain fast period of 1 hour, uh, two modes of action, a preventative and a curative. We use the word curative is really a description of when that disease has just entered that leaf area within the first 72 hours of infection. That's truly curative. But one thing we do see with Approach Prima is not only that preventative curative, but we also see that eradicant anti-sporulent activity as well, trying to reduce that additional release of additional spores from those pustules that are on the leaf surface so we don't get that secondary infection. And then two, the picoxystrobin that's in Approach Prima is also excellent for plant health effects. Generally in the later stages of July, August, into September, many of our acres can be under a lot of drought and heat stress. That's where having the picoxy and the Approach Prima can serve farmers well. So here are there more common diseases on the left, the three left pictures, the gray leaf spot, common rust, northern corn leaf blight, and then on the right, the newcomer, the tar spot. Um, we want to make sure that while our eyes are on tar spot because it's new and we're still learning a lot about it, we don't want to lose our sight on gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight that can also be very yield limiting if we're not careful and ignore them. Here's just a little bit of information on Approach Prima. What you'll notice is there are products like a headline amp that's a two-mode of action fungicide, but then also the Miravis Neo, a three-mode of action fungicide. One of the unique things with Approach Prima being two modes of action is it effectively is very effective on our key diseases and competes quite well to not only fungicides, competitive fungicides with two modes of action, but also many of those that have three modes of action. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a very economical product. Its ratings at Crop Protection Network is a really good site I would encourage you to go to. It has multi-university data with multi-university ratings for various diseases, including tar spot. And you'll see Approach Prima is in particularly highly rated for that disease. Ron?
Well, remember that real short list of insects that we had in soybeans? Now we're having to pay the piper when it comes to corn. Uh, Seems like it's almost an endless list. But if you look at the insects, primarily those listed in the VE stage, and I'm going to say for the most part, the corn is past that stage. Those are most effectively handled with a seed treatment, which most corn is going to come pre-treated, um, or a granule insecticide. So when you look at those in the ground type of pests, like wireworms and seed corn maggots and grubs, if the insecticide's not down there where the pest is, there's nothing that we can apply foliar or above the ground that's going to move its way down into where those insects are. So that's a winter decision or a spring decision or a planting time decision to take care of those kinds of pests. Once the crop starts to grow and emerge, uh, other pests can be controlled through a foliar spray, or many of those can. Things like an armyworm, stink bug, um, to a very small extent,
Yep.
stock borer. Normally, by the time we realize we have stock borer, they're already in the stock, so we can't get an insecticide in to control them. Corn rootworm larva is another one that the damage that the corn rootworm does to the corn, the biggest damage period, is that larva stage while they are chewing on the root systems. And again, unfortunately, the time to manage corn rootworm larvae that chew off the root systems is at planting time, whether that's with an insecticide in the furrow, be it liquid, be it granular, or a decision to plant a traded corn that has built-in resistance to corn rootworm that's feeding on the roots. Now you'll notice the corn rootworm will show up later as a corn rootworm adult, and that's going to be more towards tassel time. The corn rootworm adults can do damage to the corn at the tassel time if they clip silks back to the extent that you reduce pollination. Now that does generally take a lot of adults to do that, uh, but if you've got a lot of insects feeding on the roots and they are allowed uh, to pupate, they will emerge as adults. And they just went through hibernation. They're coming out hungry, and they come out hungry, and there's corn silks, and that's their food, their preferred food. And they certainly can chew those silks off. So I'm going to say, from a practical standpoint on insect scouting, at this time of year, there are certain watchouts. If you've got a big flight of cutworms, for instance, and universities are pretty good to publish the trapping, the moth trapping of cutworms, be on the lookout for that, especially if you don't have the above ground traits that help you with cutworm control. If your previous crop had a cover crop, things like armyworms might be laying eggs in that cover crop. Now we terminate the cover crop, and the armyworm eggs hatch. There again, they're hungry, and right there in front of them is a steak and potatoes with the corn. So they're gonna do a lot of damage. Can eat a lot of corn real quick. That's why, just like an army moving across, it's where they got their name. As we get later into the season, we look at things like corn borer, European or Southwest corn borer. Those pests, they were a huge pest problem in the 1980s, 1990s. And then what happened? We came out with BT corn. And the BT corn has made that European corn borer go from a major pest to a very manageable pest when you use that BT trait. And as of yet, I mean, we're almost 30 years into that trait. The traits are still working quite well as far as managing European corn borer and Southwest corn borer. But if you don't have those traits in the field, corn borer damage can be, quite devastating. And then just like the soybeans, the Japanese beetles can be a problem in corn as well, be it through silk clipping or to some extent even foliar defoliation. And then finally on the chart, you have the ear feeders, Western bean cutworm, which, as the name implies, tends to be more of a Western problem. They did move into Iowa a little bit, but I know Jason over in Nebraska battles them a whole lot more than what we do over here in Iowa. And then corn earworm. The difference between Western bean and corn earworm is just plain populations. Corn earworm are cannibalistic. So you get one of them in an ear, and they're going to be, and you get a bunch of them in the ear. There's going to be one dominant, and they're going to spend their time eating each other as opposed to the corn kernel. So not as much time for damage. Western bean cutworm, I think they believe in commune living because I remember seeing a field once that had 31 Western bean cutworm larvae inside of a single ear. And that's a record of what I've seen, but wow, was that a lot of damage by the time we found that problem. One other insect that I don't see on any of these charts, grasshoppers. Grasshoppers tend to really be thrive in a drought condition, and grasshoppers tend to prefer the grassy areas on the field borders. But keep this one in mind as you harvest the hay, the brome hay that's your waterway, and you notice as you're putting that hay down that you've got a lot of grasshoppers in your hay. Well, the restaurant just closed. They're going to find a different restaurant, and maybe they don't prefer corn over brome grass, or maybe they don't prefer soybeans over brome grass, but I don't think they're going to want to starve either. So those outside rows of the crop, when you put the hay down, they can get covered up with grasshoppers. All right, let's look at where Ridgeback fits into a corn program. What again, we'll probably focus with Ridgeback and sort of the driver pest with Ridgeback tends to be the aphids again. Again, that extremely effective knockdown on aphids and that longer residual on aphids really drives Ridgeback decision. In corn or beans, you still have the good effectiveness from the bifenthrin portion on the spider mites, corn rootworm beetles, Japanese beetles, and then things like your earworms and Western bean cutworm. Now, I do need to note with Ridgeback in corn, there's a prohibition around using it during the flowering and pollination period. So we'll make these applications on corn just pre-tassel, and then we'll pick those back up again in all practical purposes, saying at brown silk stage. So just a label restriction we have during that flower period with Ridgeback. But when we look at some of these fields, particularly next to the creeks and rivers, late season aphids can be a real problem. So having a long residual product out there with Ridgeback will help to protect that crop even from those late aphid infestations in corn.
Ron,
You know,
Jason.
Ron, one of the things that I thought I would mention too is while it doesn't work all the time to apply your insecticide and your fungicide at the same time,
Mm,
there's many instances, particularly in soybeans, where we see a bit more of a yield increase when we apply the two products together versus if we were to spray them independently. And definitely holds true on soybeans, a very high percentage of the time, and you occasionally see that as well in corn. So just a thought there,
mm.
if the windows align, consider putting your fungicide and insecticide together.
Great. Good ad. Thank you.
Yeah, and Ron, Jason, thank you for taking the time today, first off, to go through both these commodities. A lot of really good information here, Ron, that you shared on what to look for from a crop scouting, how to look for it. If we can't find it, we can't treat it. So
Right.
that's important there. And obviously, Jason and Ron did a nice job of talking about the diseases, the insects, ways to control it. Obviously, we have a lot of good tools here at Corteva AgriScience. There's other companies out there that have products as well. The main point is we're really trying to control and maximize that ROI. We've got to maximize that yield potential there with these products. If you take a second here, folks, uh, grab your phones, get the cameras out. We've got our corn and soybean disease ID guide, a great resource. Especially I know Ron and Jason and I we used to have three-ring binders and milk crates full of all our books that we carried in our trucks, and now we all carry it on the phone. And
Yeah.
these phone apps are really nice. These corn soybean disease ID guide is a nice one. If you'd like to get alerts for your local area, and typically we'll do those weekly, it's a great, back to what Ron indicated, Jason, is if you know when things are coming, you know when to be out looking for them. And if you can get a week to 10 days heads up that you're getting a disease or an insect that could be coming in your area, that's where that disease alert is a real nice tool. Again, it's one of the tools. It's not the only tool out there, but it's a nice way to kind of keep you abreast of the situations in your local area. Then you have that corn and soybean insect ID guide. Again, there is overlap between the two commodities. We can spend all day. I know Ron and Jason have a lot of wealth and experience there as it comes to a lot of commodities. But we have the time. The rest of the time here is for some Q&A, and we do have the first one that kind of comes in here. Are there in-furrow insecticides offered that provide systemic control in corn or beans? Ron, Jason, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, the industry standards that have provided some pretty good systemic control have been granule insecticides, sold under the trade names. I kind of forget the chemical names, but Counter and Thimet. These seem to be making a bit of a comeback, particularly in management of gall midge. I think we've seen some good research with Thimet on gall midge, and that's a pest we didn't discuss today. But from those standpoints, they are making a bit of a comeback. I do want to mention a caution when you're using those kinds of systemic insecticides. Some of the herbicides that we use for weed control have a very negative action with the systemic insecticides, particularly Counter and Thimet. And back in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, when those products were introduced, we saw some significant crop damage when the ALS chemistry was used in conjunction with those. And then we can also see some real restrictions around mesotrione, Callisto, or products that contain mesotrione. that the granule insecticides, systemic granular insecticides, have a bad reaction on the crops. So that's a watch out to make sure you check the labels when you're using those.
Yeah, I would say
Folks,
some of the newer insecticides are coming more on the foliar side of things than an in-furrow. The other thing that you'll notice with the newer insecticides is they're much more targeted, much more specific to a specific pest type, trying to really reduce the amount of negative impact on beneficial insects.
Hmm.
The older chemistries like the pyrethroids that once controlled beetles and your caterpillars, you're starting to see chemistries that are either going to control the beetles or they're going to control the caterpillars, but not necessarily both. But they tend to be a lot softer on some of the beneficial insects in the field.
folks, if you've got other questions for Ron or Jason, we've got a few minutes left. Ron, Jason, as we're giving the folks a little time, we're just starting for a lot of the Corn Belt. Heck, we've got some of the Corn Belt still trying to plant, and our thoughts are going out to those farmers out east as they try to get out of the wet conditions. But in the next 30 days, that's really when I think a lot of insects and diseases are starting to move in. Would you all kind of agree? That's when you kind of that last post spray in most of our corns when we really start needing to kind of making that shift. Has that been your experience?
I think both insects and disease kind of start up about that time. And in corn, they really tend to ramp up as you get towards tassel. And soybeans, they tend to really ramp up as you get towards flower. But when we think about disease problems, what they like is leaf wetness. Well, the more our canopy's closed, which we really want from a weed control standpoint, the more it makes it susceptible to diseases. And insects, they just tend to follow a cycle. They just like you and I, we're born, we're tiny, and we need time to grow before we start eating a whole lot of groceries, right? Think of the teenager sure eats a whole lot more than that, young little baby. You measure their food in ounces. Well, once those insects start to hatch and they get bigger, their appetite gets bigger, and their appetite's our crops. So we've got to, be on the watch once they start to get some size and numbers to them, and they start reproducing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that one thing on top of that, Ron, too, is you think about applications. Typically, the more water volume will help, especially in those denser canopy situations. Make sure you're getting that fungicide or insecticide much closer to the target. I know in the case of white mold, a lot of times that second application, and instead of using a nozzle that's more of a fine to medium droplet size. For that second application in white mold, you'd want to use something with a droplet size that's more coarse, allowing more pressure to be applied to get that fungicide deeper in the canopy where that disease is more relevant. So again, water volume
Mhm.
is really key, as well as maybe including some adjuvants to make sure you're getting the proper spreading of these fungicides and insecticides.
Yeah, real
Jason, you
good
bring up
point.
I spent an hour just on application technology and proper tips and tricks to make sure we're getting good coverage. And unfortunately, we don't have that time. We do have a question here. There was a question on CCA or CEUs. Currently, we are not offering these, but obviously, you can do a self-report on those. But we're not offering CCAs or CEUs today. Folks, I just want to also reiterate: use your cameras, take the picture of these QR codes. If you ever have any questions, always reach out to your local Corteva sales rep, your local retailer, county extension agent, and really pay attention to some of those newsletters coming out of our land grant universities out there. Again, as Ron and Jason have both indicated, getting that up to speed information sooner than later is always a real key to staying ahead of insects and diseases. As we finish up the webinar here, we do appreciate your participation today. And this is going to be recorded, and we will be utilizing this either on our websites and or we'll be sending it out later on for public consumption. As always, be safe out there as you continue through the spray season, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You bet. Thanks, guys.